We have a wonderful speaker to talk to you, and I'm going to call on Kira Atkins from the class of 2022 to introduce our speaker. Kira?
Thank you, Dean Hall. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon and happy Black History Month. I know we're coming to a close. I have the honor of introducing our speaker for today. Dr. Johnson is a pharmacovigilance scientist at AstraZeneca and an MUSC alumna. As a pharmacovigilance scientist, she receives all the safety data for a specific drug and is responsible for monitoring it and conducting assessments, literature reviews, and safety analysis. Dr. Johnson graduated from the College of Pharmacy in 2009 and went to complete 2 residencies, PGY1 and critical care, at Johns Hopkins Hospital, where she was hired as a critical care clinical specialist. In 2015, she joined the National Institutes of Health as a clinical pharmacy specialist and medication safety officer before joining AstraZeneca in 2019. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Johnson.
Thank you so much. That was a great introduction. So as Kira mentioned, I'm going to tell you all a little bit about my journey. Before I forget, I want to thank everyone for having me. I do really enjoy doing these, and especially just any opportunity to share my story. So with that, we'll get started. So most of this is an overview of what I've been doing since I graduated from MUSC. I was also asked to kind of share some important lessons that I'd like the current learners to know. That was really tough for me, so I kind of narrowed it down to about, I think, 4 or 5. But I'm sure there'll be others kind of sprinkled throughout the presentation because that's just kind of my presentation style. I prefer to more so tell stories. Once I was kind of done putting this all together, it felt a little incomplete to not include some challenges that I've had on this journey. So I do have a couple highlighted at the very end. So we'll talk about that and then try to leave as much time as possible for Q&A. I think that's really important just to hear, what questions you all have that maybe I glossed over. As I mentioned to Megan, I'm happy to take those throughout. I don't think the slide deck takes up the entire time. But if it's something that can wait to the end, I would still say put it in the chat so you don't forget, and then I'll kind of defer to Megan or Dr. Hall to just stop me if you think it's something that maybe shouldn't wait to the end, especially if it's more like a technical kind of question or what does that mean? Okay. All right, so I actually start with this quote. It's from Ta-Nehisi Coates' memoir to his son titled Between the World and Me. And I start with this quote because I read the book like over a year ago. But when it comes to me sort of sharing my story as like a lessons learned, whether it's for learners or if I'm sharing it with like family and friends, I do feel like that's part of my work. And so this quote really resonates with me, that my work is to give you what I know of my own particular path while allowing you to walk your own. So I by no means think that, this is the best way to do it. I certainly think through pros and cons for every both small and large decision, but if you're able to kind of pick up any sort of pearls from this, then I feel like I've done my job. I do have to give some disclosures, especially as I kind of tell this story, and I can sometimes be very candid. So I do want to make sure that, it's stated that these are just my opinions. They are not to be attributed to my current employer, AstraZeneca, or any institution that's referenced throughout. So let's get started. So again, the first chunk is my career path. And I do start pretty early on. I do think that this is important though, because careers don't happen overnight. We are very much influenced by our experiences inside and outside of school. And I chose this photo because it's very representative of the stories that I get from my family a lot, even to this day, of how much I've loved animals as a kid. So this photo was taken on my great-granddad's property in Greeleyville, South Carolina. Now, I was born in New York, but raised in South Carolina. And we would take this trip from New York to South Carolina at least once a year. And this was really my happy place. It was the most time that I could spend with like pets. It's funny because my thought was like, these are stray dogs on his property, but if I wanted to play with a stray cat in New York, like that's frowned upon. So I do think kind of these early kind of talks of like, oh, you're gonna be a veterinarian really sat with me, because when I went to undergrad, I don't even remember it being a thought. I just said that I was gonna major in animal science, and I kind of looked at schools based off of who had a vet program and who didn't. And so that's really how I ended up at the University of Georgia for undergrad, majoring in animal science. Now, obviously that didn't go as planned because I'm here talking to you all right now as a pharmacist. And so I think like many kids, I ended up having some doubts and changing my major, and thankfully I was able to talk to someone that still kind of steered me in the direction of science, saw that I did have a love for science, and when I was having some of those doubts and questions, asked me had I thought about pharmacy. And honestly, I hadn't at all. I didn't know any pharmacists. I didn't have a lot of any family that majored in any of sort of the STEM careers, not many that even went to college. So science, technology, engineering, math. But as soon as that idea was planted in my head, I immediately started doing some research on what does it take to get into pharmacy school? You know, what prerequisites will I still need? Because at that point I was already 2 years in undergrad. And literally from that point to about a year later, I had an acceptance letter from MUSC. And so I just left. I mean, very few people even knew that I had left the University of Georgia. It was such a quick decision. And so that takes us to MUSC. So I was there from 2005 to 2009. This is a photo of my grandmother and I on graduation day, very excited. And my 4 years at MUSC, actually, for me, I remember them very pleasantly. I mean, it was definitely like challenging, and I remember some long hours in the library for sure. But I had my spot where I would study. I knew where my friends were studying, both within the College of Pharmacy and College of Medicine, dental school. Like literally, I did quite a bit of networking while I was there. So my extracurricular activities spanned from, you know, pharmacy related to student government association related activities. And I kept very busy, but I think those networks and support systems really helped me get through those 4 years and really benefited me beyond, both during that time and even now. It's something that when I kind of reflect on the last 10 plus years as a common theme of both my professional and my personal kind of goals and how I spend my time. So at that point, my first stop after MUSC is the Johns Hopkins Hospital. So when I was kind of thinking about, you know, what I wanted to do, I was an intern at a community pharmacy during pharmacy school. I also even spent some time working in the nuclear pharmacy at MUSC, and that was not totally planned, but it turned out that it was a good way for me to make some money before class and still have my evenings and weekends to do the student government activities. And so that part was definitely intentional to kind of fit it all in. But I knew that whatever I decided that I ultimately wanted to do, that I would need a residency to do it. At least that was my understanding back then. So I chose a large residency program. I knew I wanted to remain on the East Coast, and Maryland kind of felt like this happy medium between Brooklyn, New York, and Columbia, South Carolina. And so I ended up in Baltimore, Maryland, at the Johns Hopkins Hospital, their East Baltimore campus. I did my pharmacy practice residency there, and my critical care residency there. My first 2 jobs was in the Hopkins Health System as a clinical pharmacy specialist. So in the time since I've left MUSC, I've had 3 roles, as you heard in my bio. And so for each of those roles, the way I kind of break this up, I have a slide with a statement of what that position should look like, ideally. So here, this one comes from the American College of Clinical Pharmacology. And then on the subsequent 1 or 2 slides, I kind of give a little bit more about what my experience was in those roles. So for this one, ACCP states that a clinical pharmacist is a practitioner who provides comprehensive medication management and related care for patients in all healthcare settings. They are licensed pharmacists with specialized advanced education and training. So that postgraduate training that I just described as an example, there's also fellowships and other ways to meet that criteria, who possess the clinical competencies necessary to practice in team-based direct patient care environments. And I would say that that was really my experience at the Johns Hopkins Hospital, both as a learner and as a clinician. The photo on this slide was staged, but it was very much representative of kind of what rounds in this particular setting looks like. So in this photo, I was doing a little bit more than rotating through their critical care units. They actually had a grant from CMS to focus on transitions of care activities. And so in this photo alone, we had definitely that collaborative team-based care that ACCP talks about. It was myself as a clinical specialist. There's a decentralized pharmacist in this photo, a social worker, nurse manager, our medical colleagues, physical therapy, and it was sharing, it was learning from each other, but ultimately making sure that the patient had everything that they needed to really just optimize that patient's care both within the hospital and as they were transitioning out of the hospital. So in addition to kind of patient care rounds, there was a lot of teaching. So they have a large residency program still, as I mentioned, and we took lots of students. So pretty much every month I either had a resident or student on rotation with me. As far as contributing to the literature, I did have some opportunities to, do some case reviews, case reports, that type. Not a lot of research in this role. If anything, it was more sort of like quality improvement, retrospective review of patients' profiles and things like that from the EMR. And some policy work, consultation, but definitely I thought it was a good experience to see how pharmacy operations work. I learned a lot outside of just being a clinical specialist that I didn't even realize I was absorbing while I was there, but was definitely helpful in my next role as well. So actually, as I was at the Hopkins Hospital, I received a phone call from one of my past residents. So if anything, this is a lesson in once you're in the role of precepting, be very kind to your students because you never know how that will come back and they might be the one telling you about a job or even hiring you. And so she tells me that she's at the NIH now. She's completed her ID residency. And there's a job for a clinical pharmacy specialist at the NIH. And prior to that time, I didn't really have a lot of reference for what the NIH did on their own campus. So, you know, coming from MUSC, being at the Johns Hopkins Hospital, I was aware of NIH funded research. I was not aware of the amount of work that they did on their own campus. And so before I kind of get into what my roles and responsibilities look like at the NIH, I did want to take at least 1 or 2 slides to kind of orient everyone for those that may be less familiar with the National Institutes of Health, although since we're in the middle of a pandemic, maybe you know more than I did back then. So it's a little different, but just bear with me for a sec. So the NIH is one of 8 agencies that falls under the United States Department of Health and Human Services. So again, kind of thinking back to when I was a student, I was aware of the FDA, so that's one of those agencies that I mentioned, the CDC. I didn't necessarily, again, put the NIH under that umbrella. They are the nation's medical research agency. And when you look at the makeup of the NIH itself, there's 27 different components called institutes and centers. So when you hear, you know, that Dr. Fauci leads the National Institute for, the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Disease, that's embarrassing, sorry, NIAID, that's one of those 27 institutes. Maybe prior to the pandemic or even now, many of you are familiar with the National Cancer Institute. That's one of those. So I was hired to support the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. And while as a clinical specialist in that role, we had our patient care rounds as well. I also sat on the investigator review board for that particular institute. And so it was really just an immersion in what clinical research looked like and what that was. So the mission is to uncover new knowledge that will lead to better health for everyone by conducting research, again, in its own laboratories, as well as supporting the research at these other hospitals, medical schools, like I mentioned. Now, the clinical center is one of those 27 institutes and centers, and that's where the research participants are actually seen. So that's their on-campus hospital, if you will, as well as their ambulatory care facilities. So they have patients that come from all over the country and the world to be seen here. They have about, at least per the website last time I looked in preparation for this, about 1,600 clinical research studies in progress. Half of these are natural history studies, especially rare diseases. So, you know, many of these patients really don't have anywhere else to go. You know, and so they come here kind of their last resort for care. And many of these are phase 1 or phase 2 studies. So these are first in human studies to test safety and efficacy. So it's a little bit of a different way to practice when you are kind of trying to optimize care for patients and you're dealing with agents that are being used for the first time in people. So I was at the NIH for about 4 years. I did come on as a clinical specialist, but actually 3 of those 4 years, I was in the role of a medication safety officer. And to kind of give everyone an overview of what that is, or you may have heard it as a medication safety pharmacist. It just kind of depends on how medication safety, patient safety is rolled out at that institution. But this statement comes from the American Society of Health System Pharmacists. And they state that it's essential that there be an innovative leader to set a vision and direction, identify opportunities to improve the medication use system, lead implementation of error prevention strategies, That includes the responsibility for leadership, medication safety expertise, influencing practice, change, research, and education. So that's a lot, but it's really important because one of the things that you may have heard is definitely something that I used to tell everyone inside and outside of my department when I was in this role, is medication safety is a part of everyone's job. If you are a pharmacist, if you're a nurse, if you're in healthcare and you touch the med-use system, medication safety is a part of your job, and that is true. But I think what ASHP is highlighting here is that you do need someone who is focused on safety. You need someone who's going to lead error prevention strategies, that's going to analyze your events, that's going to be the safety expert. And so prior to coming into this role, I don't think I really appreciated that safety sciences, like that is an area of literature in and of itself. So in the same way that I needed to stay abreast of critical care related literature, you want someone in your hospital, in your department, being very focused on medication safety and the safety sciences as an expert. So this next slide kind of helps put into perspective of where errors originate in the medication use system. And if you are unfamiliar with what all falls into the medication use system, this diagram here kind of gives you a snapshot, although I almost would kind of expand this out to not start at prescribing, but to start at the time that the drug even enters the building. But before I get to that, the data for where errors originate in the med-use system, this is pretty dated at this point. This is just from a 1996 JAMA article, but it's kind of a go-to for med-use safety to kind of show all of the different areas where errors can occur. But if you consider that, when the drug is brought into the institution, someone has to unpack that drug. If that vial is broken, making sure that they have the policies and procedures, that they know to wear gloves while unpacking, that once the drug is stored, that it's stored appropriately. Does it need to be refrigerated? Is it expired? So all of that is part of the med use process: storage, prescribing, transcribing, dispensing, administering. You can even take it all the way out here to monitoring. Once the drug is in the patient, are they being monitored appropriately based off of whatever the monitoring parameters is for that drug in that patient? And so the other huge part of my job as the med safety officer was adverse event analysis and follow-up. So we kind of looked at a snapshot of where errors can occur in the med use system, but then what you do with that information. You can get a lot of information from looking at one event. I used to call it Pandora's box because it's never what you think it is on the surface. There's always so much more. So in this Swiss cheese model, so this comes from Professor Reason's model for patient safety, they've overlaid the Swiss cheese model with an actual event. So in this case, it's wrong site surgery, just as an example. And so each slice of cheese in the Swiss cheese model is representative of a system with holes in the system of how that error made it all the way to the patient. So in this example, I won't go through it line by line, but just to give you an idea, they found that there was education was a factor in the wrong site surgery, that training was a factor, policies, technology, communication. And so that's kind of what I mean, where like these events being Pandora's box and having someone to sit there, analyze it, do the follow-up, share the lessons learned. It helps in setting the culture for your pharmacy to make sure that people feel comfortable sharing these events so that everyone can learn from it, and try to prevent it from happening. There's no such thing as zero errors. I've heard things like chasing zero, and I mean, we're human, so that alone, we bring errors with us, and it's not intentional. So being very focused on, the systems and trying to fix those to ultimately improve patient care. So this kind of brings me to my current position. So AstraZeneca is a global biopharmaceutical company. They have a couple sites here in the US, but I work at the Gaithersburg, Maryland site. And my position here is a pharmacovigilance scientist. And that's defined by the World Health Organization here. So it's the science and activities relating to detection, assessment, understanding, and preventing adverse effects of any other drug or any other drug-related problem. This applies throughout the life cycle of medicine, equally to the pre-approval stage as to the post-approval. So to put that in context, if you think about the previous roles that I had as a clinical specialist, as a med safety officer, aside from my work at the NIH, a lot of the drugs that I was dealing with were they were already on the market. They certainly could be on the market and being studied for another indication, in which case they would go through this life cycle all over again. But in the World Health Organization's definition of safety, analysis, detection throughout the life cycle, they're referring to this whole life cycle. So from the time that drug is being first used in humans in phase 1 studies, through to when it's gone to marketing, and all of the entire time that it's on the market, there are safety-related aspects that have to be followed, monitored. There are safety sections in all of the literature that you're using. So whether it's like the label of the drug, the patient leaflets, there are certain safety sections that is owned by the safety section of each pharmaceutical company. And so pharmacovigilance feeds into that as well. When we refer to safety signal detection, there are lots of different sources where this comes from. As a clinical pharmacy specialist, we reported events that makes its way to the study sponsor. So when you hear of a pharmaceutical company, you also may hear it referred to as the sponsor. Physicians, clinical trials, we get information from the literature. We have lots of interactions with the FDA and other regulatory authorities in any country where the drug is marketing. So the other way you can kind of look at pharmacovigilant scientists is in my previous positions while I was supporting patient care at that particular site. As a pharmacovigilance scientist, I'm assigned to a drug and I'm supporting patient safety anywhere that drug is used. So it's a more of a public health role than it is kind of more focused at one particular institution. And finally, I included this slide because one of the things that I didn't know or realize about pharmacovigilance before taking this position is that there's a lot more to it than signal detection and safety surveillance. It certainly depends on, you know, what phase your drug is in the life cycle. If you're in post-marketing and it's not being studied in new indications, new patient populations, you certainly may be more focused on signal detection and safety surveillance, but there's a lot of other sort of safety related work that happens. And so thankfully it's much more dynamic than what I realized it was, because that was certainly a concern when I made this transition, going from, you know, patient care settings where there's a lot going on to being more on the industry side. So that's kind of the overview of what I've been doing, what my journey has looked like since leaving MUSC. I intentionally kind of superimposed this on a mountain. This is Mount Katahdin in Maine. This is the only trip I've taken during this pandemic, was a road trip up to Maine. And it was probably the most technical hike I've ever done, and I was quite scared at times, but when it was all said and done, it was quite enjoyable. So I just thought this was a good analogy. with that, I'm going to transition into important lessons and challenges. So probably
Dachelle, before you do that, there is a question and kind of talking about your experience from Dr. Wooster, who's our department chair in drug discovery. He's saying, in my experience, science and academia and government deals with acquisition of knowledge, while corporate science is product oriented. In my field, these are equally important but vastly different worlds. What philosophical differences did you experience in making the switch to the corporate environment?
Oh, that's a good question. So I've only been in the corporate environment for a little over a year, so I think I'm still figuring that out. I don't know if I want to say the biggest difference. One of the differences I can kind of already see is that for some of my colleagues that have not been in patient care as I don't want to say as long, but have been away from the bedside a little bit longer. I think one of the things I've been able to bring to the team is just kind of to bridge that gap. So it does kind of feel like one difference is that it does feel a little bit removed. It's very product focused. There is discussions about, you know, both the science and the business, which is not something that I had, you know, thought about previously. But yeah, I think it might be a little too soon to say, but can I hear that question one more time? There may have been.
Yes, so in my field, so it just started my experience, science and academia and government deals with acquisition of knowledge, while corporate science is product oriented. In my field, these are equally important but vastly different worlds. Mm-hmm. What philosophical differences did you experience in making the switch?
Yeah, I guess maybe because I haven't been in corporate that long, I do still try to focus on the acquisition of knowledge. I think I have to work a little bit harder now to do that. So in my previous positions, whether that's because I was working on interdisciplinary teams or, you know, we would have CEs with experts in the field, it's not really like brought to me. Now I have to like really work for it. I have to seek it out. But yeah, I think that's kind of what I have right now. Is that the only question?
That's the only one I have so far.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, okay, so for lessons and challenges, this piece is pretty brief, but my number one lesson, and this kind of follows me everywhere I go, anyone who knows me, I am a big wellness, self-care, it's very important, set boundaries, make time for it type person. And it looks, you know, different now than it did when I was a student, but in hindsight, I still was doing some of that. Like I did make time to kind of catch those group fitness classes at student activities, even on MUSC's campus. It was fewer and farther between because I didn't have much control over my time. But even now, just kind of finding time to do the things that make me feel good, keep me going, keep me healthy, is something that's important to me. And it's definitely something that I always try to leave students with, because if you're just like go, 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 you will find that you're kind of like burning yourself out pretty quickly. And so figuring out, you may have to get really creative, but figuring out what's important to you. It doesn't have to be like running or yoga or any of that stuff. It might be journaling, reading, taking a walk, but kind of being very intentional about what it is that brings you joy, how you're going to show up for yourself, so that you can stay healthy and do this work. I think the other lesson actually comes from this Instagram post very recently, is that it's not just about the job title and the salary. So if you're able to kind of find a way to, you know, look at yes, the title and the salary matters, but how much free time do I have? How much time do I have for the things that I enjoy? Do I like what I'm doing? You know, am I able to take care of my physical health? What about my mental health? Is this a toxic work environment? Am I able to, you know, show up every day as my full authentic self? I think over the years, I've gotten more focused on the latter half of this diagram, whereas early on, the first half was a little bit more in the forefront. So when I was first, you know, coming out of residency, I very much thought that my position had to be in an ICU. It had to look just like my program director's role did. And over time, I got more and more comfortable in just following my curiosity, and setting boundaries and figuring out what it is that I like, and forming both personal goals as well as those professional goals. And then other lessons that I just felt like I had to include was, again, finding those peer networks and support systems, figuring out who your communities are, will be very helpful to you. There's definitely moments of feeling of isolation. I think when you're in pharmacy school and you have your pharmacy network, that can be a support system. If you're one of the only people of color, sometimes you still might feel a little isolated, and that won't be enough. And you may find yourself reaching out to other people of color in other colleges, and that's a little bit easier to do at MUSC. But once you're in the workforce, it's not as easy. You don't have, you know, student activities and student government there to kind of help facilitate those relationships. And so figuring out what your peer networks are, who your support systems are, is a huge lesson that I would pass on to students. That is something that will be good for you regardless of where you are in your career. Consciously demonstrate abilities to counteract doubt. So along the way, as you're learning these new skills, as you are in the in your career, you may have moments of doubt. You may have moments of like, can I do this? Am I smart enough? You may have interactions where you start to question that. I've been out more than 10 years, and I think I've been pretty successful, but I still have to work on imposter syndrome. And I just didn't even realize that. Even preparing for this talk, I had a couple messages come in of like, oh, congratulations. And I was like, why are you congratulating me? I like giving back my time to like the school and the students, but it's almost like I had to realize that that in and of itself could be imposter syndrome when you don't feel worthy of congratulations. So constantly being mindful that you taking stock and note of what you're good at to kind of help combat those kind of sneaky sort of mental thoughts of like, can I do this? Why am I here? Am I supposed to be here? Will be important as well. And finally, remembering your why. So I mentioned, you know, in that summary slide where I superimposed my journey on that mountain, that there will be, you know, difficult times. And I think remembering why I started, why I'm doing this, was definitely very helpful in continuing that climb, if you will. And giving back. It won't always be monetary. It could be giving of your time. It could be volunteering, taking students. It might look different depending on, you know, what you have available, but I have found that to be an important lesson, not just because of karma, not just because of the, you know, the student that ended up showing back up in my life and telling me about a job, but it's good for everyone involved to kind of remember, you know, all of the people that kind of helped you along your way and reaching back to help others. And then as far as challenges, so I have highlighted here this book. It's actually available as a PDF now online. And I was surprised, this was published in 1976, I think. It's called The Double Bind, The Price of Being a Minority Woman in Science. And this was a conference put on by the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And so like when you're looking at the fact that people of color, especially women in science, in technology, engineering, math is still very small numbers. This was something that they were talking about in 1976. And when you read this report, it's eerily similar to kind of what we're dealing with now in a lot of their recommendations. But you know, the words and some things have changed and it's more modernized. But of those things, when I kind of look at the challenges in my last, you know, decade or so in the career force, this is still very much an issue. And so I was good about finding my own mentors, finding my own support systems and peer networks, but sometimes it's still just not enough. In addition to mentorship, you do need a sponsor. And so like the biggest difference there being, you know, the person who can actually give you those promotions and those advancements to kind of speak your name when you're not in the room. That's still been a challenge. Access to resources, salary and benefit bargaining process at each of the transitions that I've made. There's kind of the spoken and then the unspoken. So there's still a lot of, we have a lot of work to do. I do think we're in an age where we're at least having open discussions about it, and that's certainly a start. But again, kind of seeing what was being discussed in 1976, even when it comes to minority women in science and seeing these same discussions now, I'm hopeful that we can start to make a little more progress. So that is all that I had, and I'll open it up for questions. Yeah.
I was going to tell you, we do have a couple of questions in the chat box, and Channing Sherman said, you mentioned that someone guided you to stay in STEM, which is still a male-dominated area. Based on your experiences, what could be done to increase female participation in STEM fields?
Yeah, so I know that's not really the case for pharmacy, but that is the case for STEM in general. So I think I was actually involved in or asked to be a mentor through, you know, what the College of Pharmacy is even doing with high school students and college students as well. I think that in and of itself is helpful. It's just one example, but when I think back to the woman who was at the veterinary hospital who said, have you thought about pharmacy? Honestly, everything seemed to be so by chance at that point. Had she not said that, I don't know what I would have decided to do. And so when, you know, I'm asked to talk to high school students or college students, I think back to myself, like if I didn't have that advice at home, if I didn't see it in my immediate family and friend circle, sometimes it does take those, you know, these sort of mentorships and these programs to be that person to say like, hey, have you looked into this? Because otherwise they have no context to even know that it's a possibility, or there's so much dialogue, or because they've seen majority white men in these fields, they just kind of decide like it's not for me. So I do think kind of like having these conversations, setting up these programs, talking to them, seeking them out is a start. It's certainly not the only one. It's not my specialty, so I'm not sure what else is recommended, but I do think that in and of itself, making the time, doing the outreach can be huge, even if you don't see it. Like I have no idea who that person's name is. I wish I can go back and thank her, but like, it was like such a small moment. You know, I'm like a work study. I just come in and kind of support the lab and leave. But in that moment, just because she said that, she probably had no idea that I immediately looked into pharmacy just because one person said that.
That's awesome. I do have a P1 student. This is, how did you chart your course to prepare for your role today? Did you do any specific volunteering, shadowing, etc.? And this is Wendy Hardy, a P1 student.
You know, I feel like for each step, it was like I prepared for like what was right here. I've certainly gotten better into looking 5-10 years out for what I wanted to do, imagine what I want my life to look like and work backwards. But that is not something that I was doing back then. It is something that I would recommend. So if you know that you want to live a certain lifestyle, you have certain interests, maybe this will sound kind of ridiculous to some people, but kind of writing that down, looking at it, saying it out loud, doing the research. Sometimes once you could physically see it, then when you see someone else that has that, then you kind of know that you can reach out to that person and say, how did you do it? I honestly, for me back then, it was more so of, you know, when I was at the University of Georgia and it looked like vet school was not gonna happen, it was, well, I have 2 years of like chemistries and calculus, and, you know, I need to pivot without the last 2 years being for nothing. So for me, sometimes it's like, back then it was very much like survival, and not intentional. I think now I'm in a place where I have the benefit of having more resource sources, having more knowledge, and so I'm able to be more proactive. Back then, honestly, it was support systems, it was talking to people, it was researching, and getting to the next step. Once I was at MUSC and I had, you know, my preceptors and my professors, I was able to talk to them. All of them had done residencies. But maybe if I knew someone who had done a fellowship, maybe I would have considered that. So it really was just kind of like being able to ask for help, doing my own research, figuring out what I wanted, and then taking the next step. So I knew it sounded like what I wanted would require a residency, so I did a residency. Then once I did the residency, it was like, well, I don't see any, you know, ideal critical care position, so let me at least stay here until I figure things out. And so it really was more of a stepwise approach. I know that's not like the answer maybe that you were looking for, but hopefully there was something good in there.
I think that's wonderful. And there was a follow-up question. I know you touched on this in the realm of science, but as a minority woman, what is your experience in corporate society?
Well, keep in mind, so I started at AstraZeneca September of 2019. So much of my corporate experience has been virtual. But I mean, so far it's similar. And there are not a lot of minorities in my specific section of patient safety. I have not in all of these years had a supervisor this is my first time having, I was gonna say it was my first time having a female supervisor, but that may not be true. I have not had a supervisor who is a minority. So I mean, so far it's pretty similar. I don't feel like, as of yet, that I have specific mentorship. I do think in this corporate environment, kind of a focused discussion on sort of individual development is happening more now than it had been in my kind of academia career. And maybe some of that is because, you know, you go to grad school, maybe you do postgraduate training, and then you kind of go into your position. But at least in my experiences, there hadn't been a lot of discussion about, you know, you're a clinical specialist now. What else do you want in your career? So this feels like the first time where there's like a focused discussion on development, and maybe that's kind of more baked into the corporate setting of like, okay, some people come in as an associate PV scientist. Do you want to be, you know, this is what we would think that you might need to do in order to become senior and principal. So maybe there's a little bit more of that sort of career climbing and ladder. And so maybe that's why it wasn't a focused discussion in my particular academic positions. But I'm sure that could be different depending on where you've practiced.
Okay, I think that I've caught all of the questions that are in the chat. If we want to open up to anybody via chat or unmuting themselves, we've got about 5 minutes, I think.
I have a question. This is Sandy still. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I was hoping you could elaborate on what you were saying about zero medication errors. I had technical difficulty and I couldn't quite grasp that, but I'm particularly interested because MUSC is now striving towards zero harm, which I was excited to hear that we're making some progress in that arena. So I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
Absolutely. I would say it's analogous to like shoot for the moon, land amongst the stars. It's a good, if you're shooting for zero, you're going to be working towards reducing harm. I cringe a little bit when I feel like people believe that they can get to zero errors. And so in an attempt to make that happen, they won't discuss errors. They won't discuss near misses. And so then you start to lose the opportunity to learn from those. You start to, it affects your culture of a safe environment to discuss, you know, prevention strategies and things like that. If people feel like they have to be perfect, you know, systems are made by humans, and humans are fallible. And so it's just the additional learnings and discussions around it, as long as people understand the goal, and they don't have something in mind that's not attainable. Does that help?
That does. Thank you. I do think that at least for my take, it's enabled me to have better conversations about reporting, and just knowing that we have C-suite buy-in towards this culture, I think is helpful. Mm-hmm. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's great.
Hello, my name is Wendy Hardy. I was the one that had a question in the chat earlier. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned earlier about your experience in nuclear pharmacy. Nuclear pharmacy and clinical research are kind of two avenues that I'm looking towards, even though I'm a P1 student. So I just want to know a little further, how did you get into nuclear pharmacy as a student to have that experience?
Yeah, so I actually had the benefit of the pharmacist that I worked with in the retail setting also worked as a pharmacist in the nuclear setting. So that was, other than that, it would not have been on my radar at all. And I was just, what am I trying to say? I'm the type of person that, like, if I want something to happen, I will find a way to make it happen. And so I think I was very much in a position of like, okay, I've gotten myself into this position of Vice President of Student Programs. I think that was the title back then. There's a lot more events than I realized of like coordinating, but I also really need a job. I need this money. And so how do I make all of these things work? And so thankfully, he told me that he could use the extra help. So I think if you know that that's an interest of yours, maybe figure out who the pharmacists are up there right now. See what sort of help that they need, or if they don't have a position open right now, ask if you can, come and volunteer. People rarely turn down free work, so it's worth a try. But that's when I kind of talk about finding those networks and setting up those communities, it does require, being okay, being uncomfortable, doing something new, being very transparent of like, hey, I've never done this before. I'm going to need probably some extra hand holding, but this is an interest of mine right now. And so I just really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
Dr. Johnson, Kira Atkins is asking, what are some things that you think set you apart going into these residencies and jobs that I imagine were rather competitive? Personal or even attributes that you developed related specifically to attending MUSC?
So I think one of the things that set me apart, at least for residency, my grades were good. They were not the best, but they were good. But all of that very varied extracurricular activities, and just kind of the work that I did within the college and outside of the college. There were awards, I think, that helped, but really just connecting with people, because that may or may not help you get positions and trainings that you may not otherwise get, but also just kind of helps you people skills, those like soft skills, because whenever I was feeling a little unsure about something, I would say, if I get an interview, I'm going to get this job. If I have some face-to-face time with this person, I can connect with people. So maybe that's it, but like definitely the opportunities and the activities kind of helped decorate my CV. But certainly being able to connect with people, I think helped.
Okay. Unfortunately, we're at the end of our time, but we really want to thank Dr. Johnson for taking time to join us today and give a very stimulating talk. And we can't thank her enough for that. I would like to remind all of our students, Dr. Johnson is a mentor in our college, and she is more than happy to meet with you and talk. And so we're very proud of her, not only giving back today for our 5th annual Black History Month seminar, but also being a kind of mentoring our students, because that is critical. Is I think she said with her getting the job at the NIH, pharmacy is a small world, so networking is always very important. But Dachelle, thank you so much.
Thank you
for a wonderful talk and spending time with us. We wish you could be here, and
I know
we could enjoy some time together. But hopefully in the near future, we'll all be back a little bit toward a new normal, and we can get back together. But thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it. Yeah, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm easy to find on just about any platform available. So thank you. I enjoyed it.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
And I will say a quick note as people log off, if your first and last name isn't a screen name, if you will make sure you get that to me, I will make sure you get your DEI credit. You can put it in the chat.
Okay. Awesome.